There is a specific moment that happens to people like you, not dramatic, not announced. You were sitting somewhere ordinary, maybe in the middle of a conversation, maybe in the silence after one, and something shifted. Like a frequency you had always been hearing became suddenly, undeniably conscious, and what you expected to feel was relief. What you actually felt was something much harder to name, because awakening was supposed to fix things. That is what nobody says out loud, but everyone secretly believes. That once you see clearly, the pain will stop. That once you understand the patterns will lose their grip. That once you know what you are, the world will finally make space for it. It did not work that way. What happened instead was this. You became more sensitive, not less. The things you used to absorb without noticing. The low-grade hostility in a room. The performance behind someone's kindness. The need buried inside someone's anger. You started feeling all of it at once, without the buffer of unconsciousness, without the mercy of not knowing. And the people around you, they did not evolve to meet you there. They stayed exactly where they were, still moving at the same speed, still expecting you to be the version of yourself they had always relied upon, the one who absorbs, who adjusts, who makes the discomfort disappear before anyone else registers that it is there. Except now, you could see the mechanism, you could name what was happening in real time, and somehow, that made it worse. You have been exhausted, not by what you feel, but by how long you have been expected to feel it quietly. Because seeing clearly and being seen clearly are two completely different things, and no one warned you that awakening would create a distance between you and almost everyone you love, a distance you didn't ask for, a distance you cannot undo. This is the hidden price, not the darkness before awakening, the specific, quiet, relentless weight that comes after. And Carl Jung spent decades watching it unfold, case after case, year after year, until he understood something that most conversations about awakening still refuse to say out loud. What he found is the part that changes everything, and it begins where almost no one thinks to look. First, let me say this clearly. You are not broken, not because of some motivational platitude, but because Jung's own clinical record says so, with precision, with evidence, across hundreds of documented individuals who arrived carrying exactly what you are carrying now. The confusion you feel is not weakness. It is the natural consequence of a very specific psychological event that has no roadmap, no ceremony, and almost no cultural recognition. You did not simply become more aware. You crossed a threshold that most people spend their entire lives carefully avoiding. Jung called it the beginning of individuation, and he was careful never to describe it as a gift, at least not at first. He described it as a summons, an internal pressure that builds until it can no longer be ignored. Something in the psyche that says, enough. Enough performing, enough absorbing, enough building your entire identity around what other people need you to be. When that internal pressure finally breaks through, it does not feel like liberation. It feels like disorientation, because the structures you use to navigate the world, the persona, the carefully constructed social self, start to feel unbearably thin. You can see through them now, yours and everyone else's. And here is what Jung understood that most people miss. The awakening does not happen because you went looking for it. It happens because the self that was being suppressed grew too large to be contained. The sensitivity was never the problem. The sensitivity was the intelligence. The problem was what you were trained to do with it. From early on, and Jung documented this pattern across case after case. Feeling-toned individuals, people whose psychological life is centered in deep emotional perception, learn a very specific lesson. The lesson is this: your perception makes people uncomfortable. Tone it down. Make yourself easier to be around. So you did. For years, maybe for decades. You learned to feel everything and say nothing. You learned to sense the tension in a room and smooth it over before anyone else noticed. You learned to carry the emotional weight of every person near you without letting anyone see how heavy it had become. Something in you always knew. You just kept choosing not to know it out loud. And then something woke up. And now the weight feels different. More visible. More yours. More impossible to pretend isn't there. Jung would say, this is not a crisis. This is accuracy. And this is where his work becomes something genuinely uncomfortable. Because what he documented next is the part that explains why awakening, without integration, can quietly become its own kind of trap. There is a particular kind of loneliness that belongs only to people who have woken up before the people around them were ready. Not the loneliness of being alone. The loneliness of being in the middle of a crowded room, a relationship, a family dinner, and feeling a distance that nobody else seems to notice. a glass wall between you and everyone who still moves at the old frequency. You did not build that wall. It appeared the moment your perception shifted, and no matter how much you want to close the distance, something in you already knows that going back is not possible. You cannot unknow what you know. You cannot unfeel what you feel. You cannot return to the comfortable numbness of before, even when you desperately want to. Jung wrote about this specific isolation with more honesty than almost anyone in the history of psychology. He described it as the cost of differentiation, the suffering of an individual whose inner development has moved beyond the level of their immediate social world, not superior, not better, simply further along a road that most people have not yet chosen to walk. And here is where the root of the hidden price becomes fully visible, because the awakened empath does not just carry their own pain, they carry the unconscious material of every person they love, every unspoken resentment, every buried fear, every wound that someone close to them has never been willing to examine. You feel it before they feel it. You see it before they can bear to look at it. And what does the psyche do when it is shown something it is not ready to see? Jung called it shadow projection. The moment your clear perception reflects someone's inner world back to them, their fear, their hidden aggression, their unacknowledged need for control, the unconscious mind does not say thank you. It turns, and the most available target for that turn is always you, the one holding the mirror so you learn something, a lesson written into your nervous system long before you had words for it. Your perception is dangerous. Keep it to yourself. The truth you see is less important than the peace it costs. And now you have woken up. The lesson is still there, encoded in every impulse to stay quiet when you see something clearly, in every hesitation before you trust what you know, in the voice that says, maybe you are wrong. Maybe you are too much. Maybe this clarity is just another form of the sensitivity you were always told was the problem. You were never too sensitive. You were surrounded by people who needed you to be less, and you were kind enough, for a long time, to oblige. Here is the most uncomfortable question in this entire conversation. How much of what you call humility, the ongoing willingness to doubt your own perception, is actually the wound still speaking? Sit with that, because what comes next depends entirely on how honestly you can answer it. Most awakened empaths, when they finally feel the full weight of what they are carrying, do one of two things. The first is the most common. They intensify the work of understanding. They read more, research more, analyze more. They go deeper into the psychology, the patterns, the archetypes, the mechanisms, as though understanding the architecture of the pain will somehow dissolve the pain itself. The mind becomes a laboratory for the wound, and the wound, paradoxically, stays exactly where it is, named, studied, but not moved through. Jung called this intellectual defense. The psyche, using its most sophisticated tool, consciousness itself, as a way of remaining safely distant from the thing that actually needs to change. The second response is the opposite. The awakened empath, exhausted by seeing too much, begins to retreat. They build structures around themselves that look like growth, clearer limits, chosen solitude, careful distance from the people who once strained them. From the outside, it resembles healing. From the inside, Jung noted, it is a quieter prison. The walls are thicker. The isolation is justified. But the self that was awakening is still waiting on the other side of them. Neither of these moves is wrong. Exactly. They are both understandable. They are both what a psyche does when it is overwhelmed by its own expansion. But neither of them is the path through. You cannot think your way into integration, and you cannot protect your way into wholeness. The hidden price of awakening is not that it made you more sensitive. It is that it made the sensitivity visible, including the parts you have spent your entire life managing, containing, apologizing for, the parts that now demand to be lived without. Translation. What is actually required is something most people find genuinely terrifying. Not more analysis, not stronger walls. Presence, full, unmanaged, unprotected presence in your own experience, with your own perception as your own authority. Before anyone else confirms what you already see, before anyone gives you permission to trust what you already know. The waiting for permission, that is the wound. The knowing that was always there, that is you. The depth of that shift, what it actually costs, and what it actually frees, is the part most conversations about awakening skip entirely. What comes next is the story Jung documented that makes the entire hidden price suddenly make sense. The story of someone who paid it in full, and what she found on the other side. Jung documented a pattern across so many of his cases that he eventually stopped treating it as individual history and started treating it as a psychological law. It followed the same arc. Every time there was a woman described across multiple composite profiles in his clinical notes, with enough detail that she becomes vivid. Who had spent 15 years in a life that looked, from the outside, entirely adequate, a functional relationship, a stable home, friends who admired her warmth. She was the person everyone came to when things fell apart, the one who absorbed, who steadied, who made everything feel manageable. She arrived in Jung's consulting room not in crisis, in a kind of permanent gray, as though the color had been slowly leaving her life for so long that she had started to forget it was ever there. She was not suffering from what had been done to her. She was suffering from who she had become in the process of surviving it. Over years of adjusting herself to the needs of everyone around her, she had done something that felt like love, but was, Jung gently noted, something closer to disappearance. She had traded her interior world for the stability of being needed. She had replaced her own depth with the function of being endlessly available. And then she woke up, not in any dramatic way. One afternoon, sitting in her kitchen after everyone had left, she noticed that she did not know what she wanted. Not just in that moment. At all. She had been so long in the business of knowing what everyone else needed that her own desire had gone. Almost entirely silent. That silence was not peace. It was the loudest thing she had ever heard. Jung worked with her carefully over the months that followed, and what he observed was not the recovery of the woman she had been before. That woman, he said, had never fully existed. What emerged instead was someone the people around her did not immediately recognize. She began to disappoint people, calmly, without apology, that went beyond what was true. She stopped absorbing what wasn't hers. She stopped adjusting herself to the temperature of every room she entered. She stopped making her presence a service, and the people who had depended on the old dynamic felt it before she said a single word. Something had shifted in the quality of her presence. Something that made certain patterns find no grip. Jung described this as the moment the individuation process becomes irreversible, and the paradox. At the center of everything she had lived through, the one that took years of pain to arrive at, is this. The love you pour into disappearing for others is not love. It is a rehearsal for your own abandonment. Let that land. Because when it does, truly does, something begins that cannot be undone. There is a version of you that is not hypothetical. Jung was insistent about this. Not poetic, insistent. He believed the individuated self was not an aspiration. It was an actuality waiting to be inhabited. Already present, already whole, already capable of exactly the quality of perception and presence that the awakening process has been. Sometimes brutally, trying to clear a path toward. What does that version of you actually look like? Not numb, not distant, not armored against the world's pain. Jung never described the individuated feeling type as someone who stopped caring. He described them as someone who finally began to care consciously, which is an entirely different thing. Conscious care knows where it ends. It knows its own edges, not as walls, but as definitions. This is who I am. This is where I end, and you begin. This is what I am willing to carry, and this is what belongs to you alone. Unconscious care, the kind most awakened empaths have practiced their entire lives, has no such knowledge. It bleeds, it merges, it mistakes absorption for love and exhaustion for devotion. The transformation Jung documented in his patients was not a hardening. It was a clarification, like water that has been turbulent for years finally becoming still enough to show you its depth. These individuals did not become less sensitive. They became sensitive with direction. They could still feel everything. The undercurrents of a room, the weight beneath a forced smile, the fear dressed as confidence. But now that perception served them, it was information, not obligation. A gift they had finally learned to hold without bleeding from it. They stopped waiting for permission to trust what they knew. They stopped apologizing for the distance their authenticity created. They stopped building identity around being needed, and started building it around being real. Jung used the language of alchemy to describe this phase. The solidifying of the transformed substance, not rigid, solid, built from the fire it passed through, not destroyed by it. If you are watching this, something in you is already in that fire, already in the middle of the process, and the fact that you are here willing to sit with the uncomfortable weight of what being awake actually costs, is not a symptom of the wound. That is evidence of the becoming, and evidence is not nothing. Evidence is everything. You made it here. And I want to be honest with you about what that means. This was not a short video with tips for sensitive people. This was an honest account of something most people never have the psychological courage to face, the real cost of waking up, and what waits on the other side of that cost. The fact that you stayed tells me something Jung believed, and I believed. That there is something in the psyche that seeks precisely what it is ready for, not always consciously, but with a precision that is almost frightening in how accurate it turns out to be. You did not arrive here by accident. Something in you chose depth when it could have chosen distraction. That choice is not small. The hidden price of awakening is real. The isolation is real. The grief of outgrowing dynamics that once felt like home is real. The exhaustion of carrying perception that the people around you are not yet willing to share. That is real. Jung never minimized any of it. But he also never stopped there, because on the other side of every one of his most difficult cases was the same finding. Individuals who had paid the price in full, and who stood on the other side, not broken by the cost, but made irreversibly whole by it. People who could feel everything and remain standing. People who could see clearly and still choose compassion. People who had earned their psychological integrity through experience and chose to use it as a foundation, not a weapon. The journey of the awakened empath is not from sensitivity to numbness. It is from unconscious absorption to conscious choice. And conscious choice, that is not the end of your sensitivity. That is your sensitivity, finally, in full service of a life that actually belongs to you. You are not too much. You never were. If this reached something true in you, leave a comment with these words. I trust what I see. Not as a slogan, as a declaration, as the beginning of something you are no longer willing to postpone. And if you haven't yet, subscribe, not because the algorithm needs it, but because what we are building here is a space for the people willing to go further than most conversations allow. A space for depth. A space for the ones who are done pretending they don't see what they see. We'll meet again in the next shadow. That truth reveals.